Hey, hi everyone. In this video, we're going to be talking about 3D modeling and visualization and different platforms you can use for 3D modeling. So after you, Gabby.
Great, thanks, Alicia. Yes, so for this presentation, we're going to start off giving a definition of 3D modeling, and then we're going to, or as we use the term, and then, as Alicia says, we're going to look at some of the software platforms that are commonly used for this. I just want to prefix this by saying that that most of the slides that we'll be using, or at least all the ones about the software platform, are borrowed from a Sonic Uses Digital Classics teaching slides that were produced by our colleague Valeria Vitala at the Alan Turing Institute for data science. So we're very much in the spirit of collaboration here. To start, the sort of question of what is 3D modeling, the term is sometimes used as a broader term to represent, to refer to any production of a 3D model, but we're using it in a slightly more limited sense, contrasted with 3D imaging. So 3D imaging is the production using scanning or photogrammetry or something similar of producing a 3D model of an object that exists, that it's going to be an accurate and exact model of an object that you have in front of you, and you're capturing it digitally into a 3D model. 3D modeling, or sometimes visualization, to be less confusing, is the creation of a 3D model of something that may not exist, or may not exist anymore, or may not exist yet. So that can include reconstructing a broken object, reconstructing a lost building that may have some remains to give you a clue as to its shape and appearance, or may not. Or it can include, 3D modeling is also broadly includes the computer-aided design, which is used, for example, by architects or by jewelry designers to produce the 3D designs of objects that haven't been built yet, but that they intend to be. And there's various different kinds of 3D modeling as summarized on this slide. In cultural heritage, what we generally use 3D modeling for is to, in some way, to test hypotheses. It's partly to communicate those hypotheses and to communicate both research findings and speculation and interpretation, but it's partly to test hypotheses. You reconstruct the walls of a building from the surviving foundations on the archaeological site to see whether it actually looks how you imagine it would look. You try putting pillars in certain places and roofs in certain places and various other things. You see how windows would look. You speculate on the size of doors and so forth, and then you can move around inside that 3D space and see whether that seems like a reasonable design. And you know, that can be quite a useful piece of sort of experimental archaeology, and a lot cheaper and a lot more flexible than going out and building a roundhouse in a field, which is something that people also associate with experimental archaeology. So that's broadly what I think of as the value of 3D modeling in cultural heritage. Alicia, you may have slightly different experiences with that. Do you want to come in there?
Yeah, I mean, testing hypotheses is a big one, but also for public engagement is another big use. So using like applying 3D modeling and into VR, you can create a space that people can virtually enter and view that no longer exists, and also combining that with 3D imaging. So you could have a virtual environment with artifacts that you're able to view that have been created from photogrammetry, say. So yeah, public engagement is a big one, but yeah.
Right, and as you said in this slide, this is one of the slides taken from a class given by Alicia, not by Valeria in this case. that you can also do some sort of scientific investigations with, I mean scientific in the sense of hard science in this case. So you talk about light and shadow, lines of sight,
Yeah,
structural
like
strength.
lines of sight, for instance, you could have, you could, yeah, map up the structural height of two buildings, say, and then map them to investigate where they were in relation to one another, and if maybe they had some connection, say one was like a domestic space, one was a sacred space, and how they related and how people interacted with these environments. Yeah.
Yeah. And you can combine that, of course, then with GIS, which has functions for line of sight and so forth. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Great. Good, thanks. So we'll now talk for a few minutes briefly about a few pieces of software which are commonly used for 3D modeling. These are only a few of the possible pieces of software out there. They include some that are fairly professional pieces of software, but they're not the highest end CAD software on the market. There are things like AutoCAD, which are can be very, very expensive, very specialist engineering and architectural software, which are kind of out of our range and are so specialist they're not necessarily the most useful for what we want to do. Some of the more commonly used in the heritage world include some of those listed here. And they have slightly different functions, as we'll say, and this will also help us to explain why we've made the decision to use SketchUp Make in the as a teaching tool for this summer school. I have a feeling that list is in a different order than the slides I'm going to go through, but the first of these is one of the most professional tools that is really, really loved by 3D modelers is 3ds Max, used to be called 3D Studio Max, by Autodesk, which unfortunately only runs on Windows. There is a free educational license which you can get on a yearly basis, but I think you can renew for as long as you qualify for it. But the full software costs somewhere around £2,000 a year. It's currently 25% off, so it's about £1,500 a year. But yes, but I don't know how long that offer will last. It is a pro architect tool. It's compatible with all sorts of other things in the Autodesk suite. And so it's very widely used in that sort of field. It gives you very granular control of the individual objects that you're modeling, as compared to some tools which you'll see, and it enables you to export your models in pretty much any format you could think of. So it's a very, very powerful tool. It's quite high end, and it's quite expensive. Although, as I say, there is this educational license which makes it attractive for academic purposes. Another extremely popular tool and slightly more flexible is Blender. This is a free tool. It's open source software. It runs on all three major computer platforms. I have found, and a lot of people I know say, that it can have a fairly steep learning curve. It can be quite difficult to learn how to use. Part of this is because it does so many things, and there are so many people who've contributed to it, that at any given point, there are like 200 options available to you. Another reason is that a lot of the functions have multiple ways to execute them. So there are things that you can select from menus, from an extended keyboard, via keyboard shortcuts, all sorts of ways of doing things, and different people will tell you their favorite shortcuts that have been produced by part of this this open access community. It does have a very, very active and very responsive development community, and it also allows you to export in several formats. So it is a very powerful tool. It's also a tool that's widely used not only in cultural heritage, it's also widely used by 3D artists and various other people who work with animators and so forth. It has a lot of functionality, and it's very it's very valuable. I've personally found it quite counterintuitive, the way a lot of things in it work. But that may just be that I started learning 3D modeling in a different tool, and so it's not doing what I'm used to. But I do think it is quite experience does suggest that this does have a pretty steep learning curve for beginners. Another fairly advanced tool. This is a tool really used for 3D animation and rendering as much as anything, but it can also be used for modeling. Is Cinema 4D. This tool has been around for quite a long time. It's got quite advanced functionality. It's very, very good at texturing the objects as it is. It's designed for animation and for gaming. So it's very, very good at adding textures to objects. You can integrate it directly with the whole Adobe Creative Suite. It is, as you see, relatively expensive. The full license is £55 a month, but the educational license is only slightly more than that per year, not per month. So it's affordable if that's something your institution is willing to invest in. But it is quite specialist for animation rather than maybe the slightly more abstract modeling that the cultural heritage practitioners are comfortable with. We then get to Sketchup. Sketchup is a tool that has changed quite a lot over the years. It's been through several iterations, partly because it's been owned by several different companies. I forget who they're even owned by now. They were owned by Google for a little while, but they were owned by someone before that, and they're now owned by someone else. There are versions for both Windows and Mac. The version which we are using currently for teaching is the 2017 version, so a few years old now, called SketchUp Make. And that version is free. It's free to download and install for both Windows and Mac, and will remain free so long as it remains compatible with the existing operating system, because it's not being updated any further. There are pro versions of this which cost only a couple £100 a year. There's an educational version which costs significantly less. There's a web version which is free, and I find almost unusable because it runs on the web, so it's quite slow and it can be quite difficult to export and save things. But it is very easy to learn. It has very limited granularity in what you can do with objects once you've created them. But it is quite easy to create objects quite quickly and to build things up from that. And it does have a few both import and export options. So it's quite usable, and it's a good learning tool. And some people use it more than as a learning tool. This is the tool used by some major modeling projects in cultural heritage. So it's relatively basic, but quite functional. A tool slightly different from the ones we've been talking about so far. This is not a 3D modeling tool per se, although you can do basic modeling in it. But this is a tool that's called, it's a real-time engine. So it enables you to produce interactive 3D models, or to take 3D models from other tools and import them, and you can produce games or gamified interaction with the models in one way or another. There's a certain amount of coding required to make anything game-like from it, but there's very, very good tutorials for that. And you can import from pretty much any format you like. And the personal version, so long as you're not going to make games which you then sell for a profit, the personal version of it is free, and there's a student version which has slightly fewer restrictions to what you can do with it, which is also free. But as I say, this isn't a tool you would use for building 3D models per se. You would most likely build your 3D models somewhere else and import them into this. But it does have quite a lot of functionality for building game-like environments. Which I say game-like because we're talking about cultural heritage and public engagement and educational uses rather than running around shooting zombies in a Mayan ziggurat or something. And finally, there's a tool that I haven't used, but I've read reviews of recently, which is again a fairly high-end tool called Rhino 3D. this tool is quite expensive for the full license, but the student version is quite affordable. It's a design tool rather than a building tool, and it's particularly admired for its ability to do free-form 3D sculpting, and especially for being able to deal with complex curves on objects. So it's you can use it to design aircraft, not necessarily aircraft that you want to build, but potentially aircraft for an animation or something. But you can use it for free-form design. So again, it's slightly less of the sorts of functions that we want for cultural heritage, but it could be of interest if you want slightly more free-form design of that kind. It does. All the reviews agree on one thing, that it has a very steep learning curve, but that once you've mastered it, it is worthwhile. It's a very powerful design tool. So maybe before I sort of summarize, Alicia has slightly different experience with using 3D tools than I do. Maybe if there's anything you wanted to add. Yeah,
well, like you mentioned, I started learning 3D on Blender, so I think maybe that's the way that it goes. When you start with it, you kind of stick with that program. But I agree, it does have a steep learning curve. But there are some very good resources out there, and there's a person on YouTube called the Blender Guru, I believe. He makes some very good videos, like intro to advanced steps. So that's worth checking out. But I do like it for, like I've used it for reconstructing pots, like pottery sherds, and seeing their dimensions and reconstructing them that way, or creating animations. So yeah, once you do get the hang of it, I think it's a good program. But yeah, you just kind of have to stick with it for a while and be patient.
Yes, and it has a slightly different set of functionalities to something like SketchUp. SketchUp is very good for creating rectangular or objects made out of multiple rectangles and triangles and so forth. That as buildings generally are. You can make circles and spheres and so forth in it, but it's really good for working from blocks and working upwards, where Blender gives you slightly more control over the geometry that you're creating. So yes, that can work.
Yeah, I guess depending on your purposes, you have to choose the right program.
Yeah. I think if you really wanted to get into Blender, I think it would be quite similar to if you really wanted to get into Unity. There'd be a bit of a learning curve. There would be a bit of having to learn a little bit of coding and to understand a little bit more about what's going on underneath the surface, and but there would be a lot of support out there for you. Thousands of hours of YouTube tutorials and whatever, and it would be very rewarding. And you probably would we'd never look back, because you'd be doing very useful things with it. I mean, I've certainly taken 3D models created in SketchUp and exported and loaded them into Unity to try and make them into things that you can make a walkthrough through and have animations in them and so forth. But the learning curve was such that I didn't ever produce anything that I would want to share with the world. But it was a lot of fun, starting to learn.
Yeah, it is kind of fun. Like, and when you finally do complete the thing that you've been trying to do, it's like such a satisfying. And you're like, I'm a genius. But another thing with Blender I find difficult is the texturing on that program. But I think some of the newer versions are making that easier. So yeah, they've got a good community, and they're updating all the time to make it better for people. Yeah,
it's a trade-off. SketchUp is very, very intuitive, and there's a particular way of doing things. So if you wanted to texture a flat surface, it's like that. If you wanted to texture a surface, a mesh surface, you can select that surface and then tell it to texture it, and it figures out what it wants to do with it. It may or may not be what you wanted it to do with it, but it figures it out. You don't have to do quite the same amount of sort of geometric algorithm figuring out yourself as you would with some more advanced tools. which can be a good or a bad thing depending on how much control you want, right?
Yeah, that's a good point.
So just to sort of sum up, we've talked about a handful of the more common tools there. There are, of course, very expensive tools out there available as well, which we haven't talked about. These are often very specialist tools. So, they're very specialist for, engineering, for, engine design, for architecture, which will have all sorts of things in, to make sure that, as you design a 99-story building, it's not going to collapse on itself, depending on what materials you make it of, and all that sort of thing, which are functionalities that we don't need, but are what make it very expensive. These tools, both the ones we've talked about and some of the more advanced and expensive ones, will be quite difficult to learn, often to the extent that you should get training specifically in that tool. And as we've said with the summary of imaging tools earlier, the project that you work on or the institution that you're based at may well have licenses for some of these more expensive tools already, and they will have their preferences and their own solutions and what you want to use. So it may be that you don't have a choice. You don't have to go looking at 100 different tools and decide which one to use. Someone will have made that decision as part of the project that you're working on. Especially the more expensive tools, the institutional licenses, are likely to be very, very expensive indeed. And so if they've already invested in one, they're not going to buy another one just to please an archaeologist, right? I mean, if they've got one that's been used by the architects, they'll say, well, you can figure that one out. So quite often it's a case of not having much choice at all. You'll have that there, but there is a massive amount of choice out there. I think that's it. Anything you'd add, Alicia?
No, I think you covered everything. Thank you for that.
Cool. Okay, great. Thank you very much.